So today what I want to share with everyone is a quick overview of our 2019-2020 new acquisitions. I'm going to be focusing primarily on our US collection, looking particularly at some major gifts. There are a few quilts in my slideshow that are from Europe. I generally handle our US and antecedent European quilts. And then Maren Hansen, our international curator, will chat with you about her pieces in a later time. So 2019 and 20 were just a banner year for the museum. This has been our largest year of growth ever. So you'll see on the slide here that we acquired 800 pieces. That works out to be about a little under half of that is actually quilts. The other pieces are things like feed sacks, blocks, papers, kits, all kinds of miscellaneous things. This brings the total number of pieces in our database up to 8,800 objects, and of those, about 5,200 are actually quilts. So what an amazing number we're at now. The other great thing is that with the additions we had this year, we now represent 64 different countries. You know, I didn't look to check and see if we have something from every state, but I do believe we do now. So a great representation. What I'm going to do today is just start out by telling you about some of the major collections that we have coming in. And this is kind of a precursor. This collection was supposed to be here as of the first week of May. We were traveling out to pack it up, but obviously that got canceled. So the red and white quilts from the exhibition Infinite Variety from the New York show that was held in 2011. And here's the wonderful book, which you can't see because I'm screen sharing. Maybe you can see it in a little bit. Joanna Rose is a New York collector who has built an amazing collection of about 650 red and white quilts. Yes, 650. So Joanna is donating that to the IQM, and we're really thrilled to be able to acquire this group. We really do love to contain an exhibition if we can, especially if it's a really significant one, a pivotal one. So we are going to get all of the quilts from this red and white exhibit. One more slide here. You might recognize Joanna Rose's name. We did do an exhibition of her cheddar quilts last year. So that was the first time that I actually got to be working with Mrs. Rose's quilts. She's been a lovely supporter of the museum though for numbers of years. Just an amazing collector, and she's one of those people who, you know, she's just drawn to quilts and she is excited about them and feels that they are a really important art form to preserve. So, and so if you're going to be working in collections, you'll be helping with accessioning and vacuuming of the Joanna Rose collection shortly. Another collection that has come in, and some of you may have seen these pieces already, is the Chintz quilts from the Poos collection, which is a group that was collected and put together by Kay and Lori Triplett, the Triplett sisters. It was also published in a book, the entire collection, when the show was at Quilt Mania in France a few years back. And it's an amazing group of about 37 quilts that represent a number of different styles in incorporating chintz. So it may be an example like this, which is obviously a chintz applique, cut out and applique to that background. There are English examples in this group. So here's a really early English example. It's interesting to see the way the chintz has been used in this piece, just in really large blocks of color. The triplets also collected pieced chintz quilts. So this is a wonderful 1,000 triangles. And I really particularly love that really wide outer border that if you look closely, you can see is a pillar print. So an actual vertical strip of a kind of a Roman column surrounded by those flowers. Just such an exuberant print. I just love it. And then, of course, we also do have some of the more traditional albums. And for those of you who saw the exhibition we did on Chintz years back, we have one quilt that had the same panel that's in the center of this quilt. It's a fruit basket, and it was one of a group of about, I think, 20 to 25 panels that Mary Kay Waldvogel has identified and dated for us. And even the little cornucopias in the outside borders are a part of that chintz that have been cut apart and put back together. This was a partial gift and a partial donation. So the Triplet sisters donated 50% of the cost of this collection. So that's a particularly exciting one for us. With the Dillo collection that we already have, this brings our chintz quilts up to about 650 in the collection. Most of those are pre-1850s, and that is a specific area within the collection that we have been focusing on and trying to add to enhance that area of the collection. The next major collection that we received is the Roderick Kiracofe collection, and we've jumped up nearly 100 years now into the 1900s. Roderick Kiracofe is an amazing individual who's been involved in quilts and quilt history for years. He wrote a book in the 1970s called The American Quilt. He was an editor of the Quilt Digest in the 1980s. And he's just been immersed in quilting. And when he started to really look at what had been preserved in museums, what people were focusing on, he realized there was really a time period that people had not focused on. And that was primarily the period from 1950 to 2000. So he really felt that that was a time period that he wanted to take a look at. And he began collecting. His quilts are all featured in his book, Unconventional and Unexpected. He really did have a specific kind of a style of quilt he was looking for. He wanted something that was really strong in its design, like this lattice quilt. He really loved print and color. So you also see here the string square or X quilt. That was a pattern he often speaks of as being really dynamic, something that really appealed to him. And he also really loves surface embellishment. So on the first slide that I showed you, we saw a tied quilt, and he really loved quilts with ties. He felt like that added dimensional quality of quilts is something that was so appealing to him, which I think to many of us, we look at tied quilts in a very different way. He also really liked the different ways that these artists would do some surface embellishment. So for example, on the slide here, the quilt on the right, no, just 8, has those repeated forms of the number 8 actually stitched with a dark black thread on all of the blocks of the quilt. Roderick just felt that many of these quilts, which were more improvisational in style, really expressed the soul of the artist making them, and that's what he was drawn to in this collection. We acquired 35 quilts, and 10 of those were donated by Roderick to the collection. I'm looking forward to working more with Roderick and hopefully acquiring more of his collection. This was just our first foray into the pieces that he owns. I think we've got one more slide here. And this is the quilt that he featured on the cover of his book. Some of these are well documented, some not so much, but it really is interesting to see that latter decades of the 20th, the 1900s represented in the collection. It definitely is an area that we're just beginning to really explore and touch on now. And of course, you probably have heard me talk about the Quilt National collection, which is one of the ones that I'm most excited about this year. And this was a project that came to fruition because of the work of 2 directors, our director, Leslie Levy, and the director of the Dairy Barn Art Center, Jane Redfern. They worked together to produce a grant which was submitted to the James Family Foundation, who then gave us support to acquire these quilts and to go back and work with a researcher who could go back to the first show in 1979, research and track down the artists that we needed that were winners of particular prizes. So the Dairy Barn did the initial search, finding these artists, getting their contact information for us, and then artists sent a form to me. From there, I spoke to them. We set up whether it was a payment, whether it was a donation, or in most cases, a combination of a partial donation and partial payment. And then, of course, working on getting the quilt paperwork done, getting the quilts sent here. We now have about 80 quilts from the Quilt National collection out of about probably a total of about 140 that were awarded prizes. They range all the way from the first 1979 exhibition, and we're actually taking any quilt from the first exhibition that we can find, and they're hard to track down from 50 or 40 years ago. But we're trying to represent every show. The Quilt National exhibition is a biennial, so it's every other year. And I think the only year that we do not have examples from right now is 1989. So that's been an amazing gift. Probably the most gratifying thing about working with the Quilt National collection is that I spoke to each of the artists, and they were so enthused and so delighted and thrilled to think that their pieces were going to be preserved here at the museum. And that's always a wonderful conversation to have, to really help people get to know us and the way that we care and preserve our collection. So the slides I'm going to show you, just a smattering of them, are in chronological order. So you can see one of the quilts from 1979. That was really striking when I looked at this slideshow and saw that dramatic X shape that Rod Kiracofe liked so much, and here it is in Judy Matheson's normal wall quilt. Joan Schultz is a leading artist that has been making quilts for decades. She's such an interesting woman, a poet, an artist, a painter, and she combines all of that in her quilts. So in this piece, you can see she's done her piecing, she's done printing, and then she's also painted over the surface of it. Excuse me. Joan is an artist that we've had on our kind of on our lists for a long time for the collection, and so through the Quilt National conversations we have, we will also be getting 3 additional pieces from Joan to really represent her career over time. So that relationship building as a part of what has happened with Quilt National has been really exciting. Elizabeth Brimelow, an artist from the UK, is an artist who we did have in the collection. We had purchased a piece of hers in the past. I love her landscapes. I think they're so striking, so dynamic, so simple, but just so appealing. There's something about her work that I really, really love. I feel like this is such an image that we see in Nebraska, kind of a cornfield after it's been harvested. That's what it makes me think of anyway. But another great piece for us to acquire. Jane Sassaman. Again, Jane is somebody who I'll be following up with now. I think she's a really important artist and scholar, author, teacher. So I'd like to see more of her quilts in the collection. I love this piece. She just does amazing work, and I like the way she kind of breaks her elements down into very simplified form. That kind of thorn from the garden, along with that print fabric, I think is just stunning. So I'm excited to get more work from Jane as well. A piece from Jean Evans. You know, I looked at this piece a number of times and I didn't really realize how figural it really is. It's abstracted like a modern painter would do, and it is a very painterly quilt in its approach. But if you look closely, you'll see things like an ironing board, a chair, a dresser, a mirror, even a figure in that piece. And I love that. I love that once you start looking at it, my eye is just so drawn to it. I look and I look and I look. Really striking. And Ellen Noble, who is another person I think is a really fascinating artist. who is an expert on dye technology and the different ways and methods of dyeing cloths. She's written numbers of books. She lectured on PBS. So again, I think this has been another kind of an entree into acquiring more pieces from Ellen, who's a very significant quilt maker. The really exciting thing I think about Quilt National, the Quilt National collection, not only the fact that we had about 7 or 8 pieces in our collection already that the Jameses had purchased, but the collection is going to continue to grow because the Leslie's been able to find sponsors who will fund 4 of the top prizes at the Quilt National show each year. The artists will have that option. Of course, if they don't want to sell their work, they can turn down the prize, but we're hopeful that we'll be able to, through purchase prizes, get the best of show, the most innovative use of the medium, surface design, and the new Emerging Artist Award. And that's a jury show. Quilt National is the top show every other year. One of the shows that artists really, really strive to be accepted in. So I think it's an amazing group of quilts for us, and really has given our studio art quilt side a boost that we needed. We're always trying to balance off our percentages a little bit better, and this has been really helpful. So Quilt National functions for us on so many levels, which is why I'm so excited about it. Eli Leon is a name that you may have heard if you read about quilts, or you might have heard us talking about this. Eli Leon was a collector of African-American quilts, and he had thousands of pieces. And we worked closely with him and his, the representative of his estate. Eli Leon passed away a couple years ago. We worked with his executor. We worked with Jonathan Holstein, who was a friend of Eli's. And so the major collection, the African-American quilts, were donated to the Berkeley Museum of Art in California, where Eli lived for the most of his life. But there were about 45 pieces that were inscribed with signatures, and those came to us here at the university. And our GTF, our Genealogical Task Force, has been busy with these quilts, documenting all the names. And you can imagine, as you look at this red work quilt, what a lot of work that would be. They do the documentation, and then they do the research of the quilts. This is a really fascinating red work quilt. We call it a commerce quilt because it actually features the names of businesses. And you may remember that we have a couple of other commerce red work quilts in the collection. They're not widely made. What's interesting is they seem to be made in the southeast corner of Nebraska and the southwest corner of Kansas. So they include wonderful blocks with all these different companies on them. But the block that was really appealing to us this year was this block that you see in the detail, and it's titled Equality Before the Law. And it's a block that represents women, famous women, for a variety of reasons, from Old Mother Eve to the 4 queens, Mary, Isabella, Elizabeth, and Victoria, Joan of Arc. But for this year, with the 100th anniversary of the right to vote being passed, it also includes the leaders of the suffragette movement, many of whom had visited Kansas. Kansas was a really active, their group of suffragettes was really active. So they had a number of conventions, and they brought in people to speak. So it's really fascinating that this commerce quilt, dated back in the late 1880s, had such a strong message in support of women and getting the right to vote. We were going to feature this in partisan pieces, which we've decided to just kind of put on the shelf for right now with our close down. But some of you may remember that that show was actually something that was produced by Kathy Moore in 2005. And we had just freshened it up and gotten it ready for an exhibition for this election year. But the good thing about that work is that it's there and it's ready to go, and I've no doubt we'll have another opportunity to show that exhibition, so hopefully you'll be able to see this quilt soon. Eli Leon had a very unique eye. He liked things that were quirky, that were different, and I think some of the quilts in this Inscribed group really show that. Just some really unusual, wonderful pieces. And I think the one of these that we really love is this quilt that came with a paper tag on it. It says, "Pieced by a boy 7 years old." We don't know who that boy is, but isn't it fascinating that they included that information on it? Just a great piece. And you know, as always, we're always really excited to be able to find quilts that have known makers or known information. It documents a quilt in a time and place and becomes a benchmark of our collection. So sometimes, like in this piece, in this particular quilt, we can't really learn more, but oftentimes at minimum, we can at least place the quilt by the names inscribed on it in the right time and the right place and confirm when that quilt was made. So these inscribed quilts are really important to us. And gosh, now with these, I don't even remember, I think we have more than 600 quilts that have been researched already, and they continue to come in. So we're managing to keep our GTF team pretty busy, even with all that they've already accomplished. Kathleen Sullivan is a collector who we've worked with in the past. I always love when we have people who come back to us that we work with again and again. I think it shows that they trust us, that they are pleased with the way we care for their quilts and preserve them. And Kathleen Sullivan particularly collected in the southern states of the United States, which was an area that, again, we were really low on numbers with. So she really helped us to fill a gap in the collection that was really necessary. Her quilts are primarily from the first half of the 20th century, but some go up to 1960s and 70s as well. There's that X shape again. That is a really dynamic pattern, isn't it? We're obviously always drawn to those images. Something about that form that your eye really likes. And here's a couple more. Roderick Kiracofe would love this collection now that I'm seeing it, having just looked at the pieces that we purchased from him. These are very related. Both of these are tied quilts. I'm coming around to the tied quilt, I have to say. It's an interesting design element that I'm liking more and more. When we acquire quilts, we are always looking to add to regional styles that we have in the collection or subsets within the collection that are important. So here we have what we call a fracture quilt, and we call it that because of the way that the names on the quilts are actually inscribed. They are done in a fracture lettering style, which is very reminiscent of the Pennsylvania Dutch. And they have it's a very distinctive style of writing that was used on things like marriage and baptismal records. You see it quite frequently. It's a hard inscription to read until you really practice. There's a few tips you learn and that make everything kind of become much more clear to you. Oftentimes these quilts have a little German saying on them, saying "Ihr Teppich," which means her blanket. And so we can sometimes know who the quilt was made for, and also sometimes identify which of 3 or 4 different scriveners that were actually doing the inked inscriptions on these quilts. And that's due to a collection that came to us from Lucinda Cawley, who has done the research on fracture quilts, the really in-depth research. It's a fascinating group of quilts. More and more keep showing up, and we try to find them and acquire them because that regional story is so important to our 19th century quilts. Another quilt that comes with great research in a strong group of regional pieces is this album made in the Miami Valley, Ohio area. We acquired Sue Cummings' collection of more than 30 of these, closer to 35, I believe. And Sue had written a wonderful book on these quilts, on the style itself, on the common elements you see in them, and believes that these quilts were actually made for young men as they were coming of age. So when they had their 21st birthday, they would receive a quilt. We're not positive of that particular reasoning, but the quilts oftentimes have wonderful little phrases on them or little kind of inscribed details that kind of help us to that conclusion. The GTF probably could tell me better about that quilt than I can.
Carolyn,
but it's, yeah.
Do you have a close-up of any of the sayings?
Not on this piece, I don't. It's just
Okay.
a little too new. I don't think it's even been transcribed yet.
Oh, good. Maybe we'll get to work on that.
I bet you will. And it's really fascinating because the blocks are similar. The way you can see some of these blocks are actually kind of cut off. That's a technique that obviously they're just cutting off blocks to make them fit. The colors are the same. That eagle in the center is a repeated element. So they are really closely tied. But when we do the genealogy, we don't find relationships among them as like family members or even living really close to each other. So it was fairly widespread in that area of the world. So it's really wonderful to have such a richly researched topic that we can then add to. So one of the other areas that we're really looking at doing more research on and delving into is the Modern Quilt Guild. We're thrilled to have this Pick Up Sticks quilts from Weeks Ringel and Bill Kerr, who were the founders of the Modern Quilt Studio. And really, what we're trying to do now is to look at these phenomenons that have happened since really in the last 50 years, since the 1970s, and trying to do a really systematic research approach so that we will look at who were the movers and shakers were, who were influential, what quilts we really need to have, and then pursue those. Another artist that falls into that Modern Quilt Guild is Heather Prager. She has done this tuning fork series that has become really well known and popular. In fact, you begin to see people as you know, teachers are out on the circuit teaching their classes, you begin to see these kind of related quilts very often. And we try to go back to who was that original founder, who was the first person, who kind of inspired all of these other quilts. So I really love this work. The marsh near First Encounter Beach here on the right, it just calls to me. I love it. I absolutely love it. There's something about it that when you read the title and you see what she's trying to portray in her quilt, even while using that same tuning fork element throughout it, it really succeeds for me. I love it. Just love it. I'm always happy when we can get quilts that I love personally. Not that should always be the deciding factor, right? Another donation from a contemporary artist, Janet Stedman, was really significant last year. Janet gave us 16 quilts. She was a student of Nancy Crow, of Michael James. In fact, I really enjoyed, she kept all of her information from the classes she took, and she had great photos. So to see Michael James working way back in the 1970s was a kind of a fun little journey back. The quilt on the left here, Spiral Progress, if you look closely at that image, you can see the quilt's actually folded over. It's so large, we couldn't photograph it on our tables without that fold. It was the first quilt that Janet made, and she made it for a round bed that she owned. I love that story. But I think it really does say a lot about the time period that early quilters, she had made earlier quilts. This is her first real an original design. And I love the way you see these early artists really working with color. So the gradation of color that she's created, working with that spiral to create that three-dimensional look. I think we see that in a lot of artists that were really just starting out and kind of exploring the way they could take the medium of quilt making into a whole new direction and a whole new ground. So Janet moved out to Whidbey Island in the early 2000s, and her work really changed and reflected that. This kind of more naturalistic look is something she became very well known for. And she's a Nebraskan now. She's moved to Omaha to be with her family. So we're gonna have to get Janet down here to the museum and visit us. Again, she's come before. A couple of other random new pieces. Linda Pumphrey, our acquisitions coordinator, is always out and kind of surveying auction houses. She keeps track of things that are being sold through auctions. And so do other members of our acquisition committee. Jonathan Holstein can't resist checking out every auction and pointing out some really unusual pieces. So these two, with their military connection, make them really exciting for us. They are very unique and unusual. The quilt on the left is made of badges and patches from military uniforms during the Vietnam War, and that's really unusual. Sue Reich is the kind of the expert on military quilts of the 20th century, and she said that's very, very rare to find. So that was a great piece. And then the V for Victory. Love those patriotic quilts. They're just a great sub set within the collection that we're building slowly but surely. A couple of great whole cloth quilts that came in, and these again were from individuals who we worked with in the past. So the quilt on the left is a printed patchwork or a cheater cloth, which is really unusual to find. We have a couple in the collection, but we did not have one with this particular design on it. And this came from the Pilgrim and Roy collection. So Gerald Roy has been a really great donor and dealer that we've been working with in the collection as he kind of disseminates his collection out into the world. And the whole cloth, which is another pillar print like we talked about earlier, you can see better in this image that vertical design. This came from the daughter of Marilyn Karp, who has donated to us 3 or 4 times. Marilyn was a New York studio gallery owner. She knew New York artists. She made a quilt in the 1976 or 77 that was a bicentennial quilt, where she asked all of these New York artists to make a block for her quilt, and then she put it together. So she has been incredibly generous with us as well. And of course, we are really, really lucky to have opportunities like we did with Jonathan Gregory's research on Ernest Haight that he did for his PhD. It also resulted in an exhibition here at the museum a few years back. And Jonathan just made, had established great relationships with the family. So we had acquired some pieces when we had the exhibition. And then just last year, the family came to us and said, we've got additional quilts. Would you be interested in more? So we were able to add some from Ernest, from his family, and also from the in-laws side of the family, but some great pieces that have really outstanding documentation. We're always really happy to add some of our Nebraska artists. And so here are a couple more that came in, and these come in as just a kind of random donations that come through our website, or people might get my email or might send a letter. We finally looked and did some charting to see that we only accept about 20%, and that's a pretty generous number right now. I think typically it's closer to 10%, but these 2 pieces were made by 2 sisters in Nebraska. And I thought they were just a wonderful, charming group. What we're looking for with our traditional quilts now, because our collection has grown substantially, we really are trying to be very, very deliberate in our choices. So the committee is looking for things like known documentation. So we want to know who made the quilt and why, when. And if it's not well documented, it's going to have to be something really spectacular. We really want to slow down the growth on the side of the US traditional quilts and kind of take stock of where we're at. And again, take a more measured approach to the pieces that we do acquire. And keep in mind, are we going to be able to keep up with the very stringent steps that we have to take to care for the collection? In other words, just refolding the collection every 2 years is a huge job that we really couldn't keep up with without all you volunteers. So we want to be aware of that too. We want to make sure that we're operating within our American Alliance of Museums guidelines as an accredited museum. So we're going to try and really be very, very critical about what comes into the collection now, which is, I'm glad we have Sarah and Jamie. Sarah and Jamie are slowly taking over some of those roles with donations, and I think they're just a little bit more ruthless, in a good way, about what we add to the collection. And then just one more collection that I wanted to highlight today, and that is Gloria Hall and her grandson, Paul Pugsley. As you know, Gloria passed away last year. She had an amazing collection. She had done incredible research with her feed sacks and feed sack collection. So here are a couple of feed sack quilts. But in addition, so I think what was it? We got 18 quilts from Gloria. a number of which are inscribed, so there'll be 9 or 10 there that need research, and the others had some kind of a strong feed sack element to them. And then I think an additional 6 quilts from Paul came into the collection, one a very early 1830s East Coast example. But what was really exciting in addition to those quilts were the feed sacks that came in. So we acquired, they donated about 800 feed sacks. We went through, we selected all that were still in their original shape. In other words, they had not been picked apart yet, to flatten them out for use. We tried to look at the design of the feed sacks, anything that was unusual. I have to say, I love this disco hybrid seed corn bag. What a crazy name. But so we tried to just take a really great representational group of feed sacks. So we added about 200 to the collection, and the others, Paul and Gloria okayed us selling in the shop. So they have been an incredible fundraising piece of this whole picture. So you might have seen those in the shop. Our chicken salad gals do a really good job packaging those, and they fly off the shelves in the shop. And just one last slide. I love this. I think this is just shows the depth of Gloria's collecting and research. So here we have a couple of items that were made out of feed sacks. And then along with that, we have different colorways of the same fabric that was used in the PJs and the dress. And I think that just, you know, when we can show how they were used, how they were originally when the person selected the feed bag, and then saving these large portions of them. I think we still have a lot more feed sacks that'll be going out to the gift shop as well if you're interested in acquiring those. We do also have a great little swatch collection of feed sacks that we have up in the library that was given to us, and I think many of you helped us to translate that from just a photo album format into an album that we did on acid-free paper, and we sewed the swatches to the paper so that we could preserve those over time. So I feel like we've got a really great handle on feed sacks now, which is really an important part. We know, particularly here in the Midwest, but really was popular throughout the US.